Metal Gear Solid 5's prequel, Ground Zeroes, was a strange title, acting as a setup for the Phantom Pain, a demo, and a paid release all at the same time. There was much discussion when gamers got their hands on it about whether a game some considered to be little more than a glorified demo should have had a price tag at all. And while there's absolutely some merit to the argument that Ground Zeroes could, and perhaps even should have been free, what there can be no debate about is its quality. Ground Zeroes is a fantastic game in and of itself, and one that conjures up more than a few memories of Metal Gear Solid 2's Tanker Chapter. Today, I want to take a closer look at why I consider Ground Zeroes to be a pseudo-sequel to that Tanker Chapter, and examine more closely how it built on the idea of a playable Metal Gear Solid prequel released ahead of a fuller game. If you enjoy the video, do consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. And now, let's begin by taking a look at the similarities between how Ground Zeroes and Metal Gear Solid 2's Tanker use their main character. At the time of Ground Zeroes' release, there were obvious comparisons to be made to Solid Snake's mission aboard the USS Discovery. For the casual observer, this was primarily down to the circumstances surrounding the release of each title. Metal Gear Solid 2's Tanker Chapter was released ahead of the full game as a demo packaged alongside Konami's Zone of the Enders, while Ground Zeroes was a paid release, again initially available separate to the title it preceded. However, while the Tanker Chapter was included as part of Metal Gear Solid 2, although players could choose to skip it if they wished, Ground Zeroes wasn't packaged alongside the Phantom Pain until a fair amount of time after its release. It was a baffling decision, especially given how much exposition is featured in Ground Zeroes, and the only reason I can honestly think of for it not being included alongside the Phantom Pain is that Konami wanted to maximise their earnings across both titles. I don't think there can be any arguing that both are crucial parts of the larger games they're attached to, and thus vital inclusions. Perhaps the biggest reason for them being so vital is because of how they use their main characters, and it's at this point I want to quickly mention that there will be spoilers for both Ground Zeroes and Metal Gear Solid 5, and Metal Gear Solid 2's Tanker if you've not managed to have a crack at that either, from here on out. On the off chance you're watching this video without experience of the games I'm talking about, what it boils down to is that both prequels are the only time players actually take control of Solid Snake and Big Boss, with neither acting as the main character in the games that come after them. Solid Snake did of course return during 2's Plant Chapter as Iroquois Pliskin, and Big Boss does appear briefly in the Phantom Pain as Ishmael, but during both Ground Zeroes and the Tanker Chapter, players were left purposely unaware that this would be the case. Indeed, when it comes to Ground Zeroes, this is in fact the final occasion in the entirety of the franchise that players take control of Big Boss. All in all, the decision to switch characters is far more impactful in Metal Gear Solid 2, for the simple reason that it has a real and tangible effect on the rest of the game, while the change of characters from Ground Zeroes to the Phantom Pain is only revealed at the very end of the game, leaving players to look at the experience through a lens retrospectively, rather than it affecting their experience during the game itself, like it does in 2. It would be unfair to say that the bait and switch between Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain doesn't carry huge consequence to the plot of the series, but with the reveal coming so late, it colours the narrative in a way that doesn't feel wholly satisfying. Because players aren't living with the idea of switching characters during the Phantom Pain itself, and because Big Boss and Venom Snake are near indistinguishable to begin with, it just doesn't have anywhere near the same impact. It's underwhelming to say the least. Everything the player goes through in 5 ultimately isn't down to Big Boss, and so much of the narrative weight Ground Zeroes helps build up is lost. The twist during the Phantom Pain's conclusion was exciting at surface level, but in reality it cheapens much of what Ground Zeroes and 5 built up as a result, which is a great shame. Putting the change of main characters to one side, what Ground Zeroes does build on from 2's Tanker is how it tells its story. 2's Tanker set itself up as a short story of sorts, one connected to a wider narrative, but that could also be understood by gamers who were perhaps jumping into the series for the first time. And Ground Zeroes does this too, to a certain extent. There's a simple enough mission and associated story for those unfamiliar with the series to follow, namely, they have to enter the camp, rescue Chico and Paz, and escape. But at the same time, it also weaves in a lot more references to the series' overarching narrative, with mention of 3's events made in text form at the mission's outset, and allusions to Cypher made shortly after, during the game's opening cinematic. Ground Zeroes definitely isn't quite as self-contained as the Tanker, which loaded much of its overarching exposition at the back end of its chapter, but the evolution of the format, where the short story style from 2's Tanker remains, but with many more nods to the wider Metal Gear plot also included, works really well. With 4 mainline games in the series, and Peace Walker already released, it would have been a huge risk not to have tied Ground Zeroes much more closely to the series' wider story. And so it makes sense that there is far more exposition on offer for those who want more detail than what the Tanker chapter offered in 2. But the real beauty of how it's designed is that much of that is left up to the player. Simply following the plot of Ground Zeroes, there's a relatively simple story at its core, but for those who do want those extra layers of detail, there's a wealth of information available if they're willing to invest a little extra time, primarily through the cassette tapes which can be collected across Ground Zeroes and its secondary missions. There is also the option to read a more thorough explanation of the backstory leading into the game, but this feels like much more of an afterthought, simply placed on the main menu for players to read at their whim. The cassette tapes, on the other hand, are a fantastic idea. Ground Zero's main mission can be completed fairly quickly, especially once players understand exactly what they need to do, so introducing a collectible which directly influences their understanding of the plot is a really nice addition. For those who want to uncover every little thing the game has to offer, they're a great incentive to explore, and likewise, for those who just want to finish the game and get on with their lives, they're not vital to gaining at least a broad understanding of what's happening moving from Ground Zeroes into the Phantom Pain. Players can spend more time with the game, searching every nook and cranny, and be rewarded with a firmer grasp of the story, or equally, they can complete the main mission and put the game back on the shelf, while still experiencing a satisfying conclusion. Indeed, at the end of both 2's Tanker and Ground Zeroes, players are left with an easily understood cliffhanger designed to appeal to the widest possible audience regardless of how much additional exploration they've done. At the end of the Tanker, Ocelot has escaped with Metal Gear Ray and must presumably now be thwarted, and at the end of Ground Zeroes, Mother Base is destroyed and Big Boss is left badly wounded. Ground Zeroes can be a long short story or a pretty short story, and the fact it lets players choose which they want to experience makes the title so much more accessible to a wider audience than it would have been should all of the detail from the tapes have been included in the main mission as well. But there is one tape in particular that has proven to be extremely controversial, some might say with good reason, that I want to quickly touch on, the cassette featuring Skullface interrogating Chico and Paz. I don't want to go into exhaustive detail about whether using rape against a female character to make an antagonist seem extra evil is particularly good storytelling, but what I do want to touch on is the idea that it shouldn't have been included at all, which is an argument I saw used by some, especially around the time of Ground Zero's release. Ground Zero's anti-war message really couldn't have been made any clearer from its outset. One of the most prominent early shots during the opening cinematic, about 5 seconds after the game begins, focuses in on a sign featuring the name of the camp, the fact it's run by the US Joint Security Group, and that it's located in the south of Cuba. For most, this would have immediately drawn comparisons to Guantanamo Bay, which was also located in Cuba and run by the US. Even the name Camp Omega is eerily similar to Camp Echo and Camp Delta at Guantanamo. The scene continues, showing prisoners of war being very badly mistreated, and throughout its entire runtime, Ground Zeroes very obviously sets itself up to be a commentary on just how horrific war is. In that context, the idea of featuring rape within the game isn't an altogether outlandish one. Indeed, Majid Khan, a prisoner at Guantanamo Bay, had to suffer the indignity of rectal feeding during his imprisonment, and it suggested rape was often used as, at minimum, a threat towards prisoners. And so, I genuinely believe its inclusion as a subject within the wider context of Ground Zeroes is completely justified given the game's themes. If games ever want to truly be considered to be art in the same vein as other mediums, then these issues do need to be addressed when appropriate. And in that capacity, I do applaud Kojima for daring to tackle it. Unfortunately, however, the scene itself is far too stylized and is generally not handled well at all, and for that, Kojima can absolutely be criticised. Skullface's sweet and sour line, followed quickly by the one about a taste test, are prime examples. The scene feels like it's written as a way of letting players know how terrible Skullface is, without any of the necessary build-up required to really make events hit home. Rather than building a richer story around Skullface as a means to justify why he's so awful, Kojima uses the tape and what happens during it as a quick route to creating a somewhat similar effect. It's lazy storytelling, and it doesn't really hit the mark at all. When compared to how brilliantly other villains are portrayed throughout the series, for example, Ocelot's scenes at the end of 2's Tanker Chapter, it's definitely not Kojima's finest work. However, attempting to dissuade developers from examining topics similar to this one because of examples like Ground Zeroes would 100% be the wrong direction to take. What the discussion should be around is the merits of covering them, when it would be appropriate to do so, and of course, how to actually do it. Another argument I've heard is that the tapes in general are perhaps not the best way of giving exposition to players, compared to the more cinematic approach taken throughout much of the series. When I played Ground Zeroes for the first time, prior to the release of 5, I would have disagreed with this assertion. As stated previously, I don't think the idea of giving players the choice as to how much additional story they want to indulge in is inherently a bad one. But looking back, having played the Phantom Pain, I have had to re-examine that view somewhat. In Ground Zeroes, I do think they work brilliantly. There are a decent number of tapes, but they never feel overwhelming in terms of both the requirements for collecting them or the amount featured. And they encourage players to check out the different missions included in the game, which was really important in getting them familiar with how the Phantom Pain worked. In 5, areas can be played during the day or at night, may be visited more than once using different angles of approach, and will contain different objectives, much like Ground Zero's side missions are set up. However, it was clearly the start of a trend towards using those tapes as a crutch to add extra detail in 5, and the sheer number there are for players to listen to in that game is definitely overwhelming. And so, while I do consider them to work well in the smaller confines of Ground Zeroes, they did clearly mark the beginning of what became something of an issue for me when the Phantom Pain came around, with simply too many tapes on offer compared to the minimal amount of storytelling done through cinematics. What the tapes also marked, when combined with the setting and a story that's generally played much straighter than previous titles, is a very dramatic shift in tone from the rest of the series. Playing 2's Tanker Chapter, it's very clear you're playing a Metal Gear Solid game in the way it tells its story and the way it presents its characters. But Ground Zeroes is a much darker, more realistic experience, and with that comes a trade-off. It feels realistic to a point where you can almost imagine much of it actually happening, but at the same time, in doing so, it loses a lot of the Metal Gear Solid essence in the process. I would argue that you could take Ground Zeroes, switch up the character names and tweak the script ever so slightly, and sell it as an entirely new franchise, but I just don't think you could do the same with 2's Tanker without it still quickly becoming obvious as to what series it originated from. 2's Tanker features a giant robot and a transplanted arm which takes over its owner. Ground Zeroes, on the other hand, is much more reserved. It's also interesting that Ground Zeroes is seemingly happy to spread its exposition across its main and side missions, but removes its more wacky elements from all of them, keeping that side of the series mostly confined to its Deja Vu and Jamais Vu side missions. The Phantom Pain does reintroduce a lot more of those elements later on, but they're definitely notable in their absence in Ground Zeroes. Whether this darker tone and more grounded atmosphere is a good thing is really up to players, but equally there's enough depth woven into Ground Zero's story and the accompanying tapes that series veterans also have something to get their teeth into. It's definitely not quite as self-contained a narrative as the Tanker Chapter is, but I think given how much the series' plot had grown in complexity by the time of Ground Zero's release, adding in that extra detail was absolutely the right direction to take. The impact of its story was arguably weakened due to events in 5, but I'm not sure how fair it is to judge Ground Zeroes for the sins of its father, especially since they were kept so separate to begin with. What it ultimately does so well is give players a choice. They can get through the game as quickly as possible to simply ready themselves for the Phantom Pain, or they can spend much longer attempting to uncover its secrets across multiple missions. It caters to both audiences, but in a subtle enough way that neither route necessarily feels like the right one, which I think is the perfect way to tell a story in a short prequel like Ground Zeroes. Moving away from how the story is presented and towards the gameplay itself, it's easy again to see where Ground Zeroes got its inspiration from. Ground Zeroes is Metal Gear Solid 5's version of 2's Tanker Chapter in the way it's designed and the way it introduces new mechanics to players, and it's done to great effect. 2's Tanker could in no way be considered to be an open world, and to even call it linear would be a stretch. There is backtracking and some opportunity to explore, but for all intents and purposes, the mission leads players down a fairly linear path. Likewise, Ground Zeroes isn't an open world game either. I would classify both as sandboxes. It's true that the size of those sandboxes greatly differ between the two, with Ground Zeroes being much more open, but at their core, they're both about acclimatizing players to the gameplay and options available to them in much less daunting settings than the games which follow. Taking control of Big Boss at the start of Ground Zeroes' main mission, there are a lot of similarities right off the bat. Both Snake and Big Boss are shown actually making their way towards where their missions take place, with Solid Snake jumping off a bridge, while Big Boss climbs a cliff face. The lashing rain featured in Ground Zeroes evokes memory of the tanker's exterior, and both missions hand over control to the player with them having a full view of the area they're about to infiltrate. Of course in 2, only the exterior of the tanker is visible, but Ground Zeroes takes it a step further and gives players a full view of much of the camp they're about to make their way through, which makes for a really atmospheric opening. Another way Ground Zeroes mirrors 2's Tanker is in how it gives players a choice of how to enter the camp, before introducing them to a different mechanic depending on the route they chose. In 2, players could take a door on the left side of the ship to meet a guard patrolling near a set of lockers, designed to introduce them to the idea of hiding bodies, while taking the door on the right of the ship's deck would lead to an area demonstrating how shadows are also a factor in sneaking. Ground Zeroes also offers players two choices. A spotlight and lighting around a nearby gate draws their attention in that direction, suggesting they use the gate to enter the camp, while the more astute might notice a path which can be used to bypass that route entirely and give them an alternative point of entry in the process. And whichever direction they head in, a new mechanic presents itself. Should they choose the gate, they'll have the option to use a lockpick to open it, introducing them to that mechanic, while the path over the fence drops players down into bushes placed directly below the ledge, demonstrating to them that they can be used to conceal themselves. It's no coincidence, in fact, that a car comes round the corner soon after dropping down, further encouraging players to do just that. There are two reasons in particular why I love that Ground Zeroes borrowed this idea of introducing route-dependent mechanic introductions from the tanker chapter. Firstly, because Ground Zeroes in general gives players a lot more freedom in terms of approach, a lot more choice about how they move through the environment and in what direction. This opening decision acts as a gateway choice of sorts. The very first task players need to complete offers a choice of solutions, and in doing so, Ground Zeroes wants players to understand that they'll always have options as to how they approach a given situation throughout their time with the game. Secondly, it's also great game design because it's proof that just because a world becomes larger and offers more choice, it doesn't mean it automatically becomes less focused as well. The tanker chapter would absolutely have been easier to design than Ground Zeroes due to its narrower environments, so it's really impressive to see that Kojima was nonetheless still able to translate design principles from that game into one much larger in scope. And speaking of choices, once inside the camp, the full scale of what that idea entails really becomes clear. 2's tanker did feature some opportunities to move backwards and forwards through its areas, but what's featured in Ground Zeroes is on another level entirely. What I think its map does a great job of, especially when applied to the main mission, is using its design to funnel players in the right direction through the use of its roads. Should Ground Zeroes have been a collection of the same area without these roads running in between them, I think the map would have been extremely confusing, especially given the weather and lack of light reducing visibility. The roads then work so well not only because they break up all these smaller areas into chunks that are much easier for players to map out in their head, such as the camps on the left and right side of the map, or the silos running down the middle, but also because they help point players towards areas they may not have visited. In their own way, they are very, very subtle signposts. The roads are used to lead players to new areas, crucially on the right side of the map towards where the prisoners are being held, or, equally importantly, towards the top of the camp where Paz is located, but they don't explicitly tell players to head in any given direction. They lead to almost every area of the map, but players are given agency to choose which road to follow as they start to explore, without being pushed towards one path in particular. But if players do follow all of the different roads running through the camp, then they're almost assured to see most of what the entire map has to offer. It's very cleverly designed. And once players are better acclimatized to the layout of the map itself, Ground Zeroes very quickly becomes the sandbox I mentioned earlier. There's not so much to talk about here in terms of how it's set up, but the design philosophy of 2's tanker remains consistent here. Give players a large space they can interact with, and let players figure the rest out. Across Ground Zeroes' map, there's ample opportunity to experiment, whether it's through the use of vehicles, utilising different extraction points, or messing with guards to gain a better understanding of how they function. Or, of course, trying out the new mechanics I've never personally been a fan of, such as marking enemies or reflex mode. Ground Zeroes very much leaves it to players to work out the best approach to any given task, although it does on occasion use subtle direction to help them out where possible. My favourite example of this is the tape given to Big Boss by Chico after he's been rescued, which hints at the idea of using a truck to enter the base where Paz is being kept prisoner.
I hear vehicles. And a flag. Must be near the heliport. A gate.
But there's also plenty of reward for exploring too, which gives eagle-eyed players the opportunity to turn the odds in their favour should they investigate the map more thoroughly. A great example of this is the option to switch off the power within the base. It's a very useful tactic should players find it, but equally, many could go through the entire mission without ever realising it's even possible to do such a thing. There's also crawl spaces which provide another route into the base, warehouses which can be looted for supplies, and guards who can be held hostage for additional information. It takes the idea of experimentation in a smaller space, so well executed in 2's tanker, and dials it up to 11. It's truly a wonderful thing to witness, and it works brilliantly as a proof of concept for the Phantom Pain's open-ended design. And that's what Ground Zeroes and 2's Tanker Chapter are, brilliant proofs of concept. The Tanker introduced the idea of a Metal Gear Solid prequel and did a fantastic job of telling its story in a way players with varied experience of the series could engage with, while also helping players get used to its mechanics in a less expansive environment than the one they would experience in the game which followed it. Ground Zeroes takes this idea and expands on it beautifully, packing more story and gameplay options into a map which extends far beyond the reaches of 2's relatively narrow Tanker. Is there the occasional misstep? Definitely, especially when looking at a couple of issues surrounding the story I spoke about towards the beginning of the video, but all in all, Ground Zeroes does a fantastic job of acting as a prelude to the Phantom Pain and getting players ready for the wealth of new mechanics it introduced. In all honesty, I'd even go so far as to say that I enjoy Ground Zeroes more than a lot of the missions in 5 itself. I'd also suggest that even if you are someone put off by the idea of a Metal Gear Solid game set in much larger maps than its predecessors, you should definitely give Ground Zeroes a try. You might just find that it's exactly the Metal Gear Solid game you never thought you needed. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell to let you know when a new video is released. And hopefully, I'll see you all again soon.